Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I want to break down a sparring match between myself and my friend Dan. Dan's going to be on the left here, I'm on the right, in case you didn't know. And normally I don't like to use sparring footage for doing reviews, primarily because people just flat out don't fence the same when they're trying to win as opposed to when they're just trying to have some fun. But I thought there were some very illuminating exchanges in here, particularly on the subject of footwork. Footwork is something that's very hard to talk about in the world of HEMA because it, and on the one hand, is extremely difficult to describe and does not come up in any of the texts, so you often can't connect footwork conversations to the historical side of HEMA. But at the same time, it is undoubtedly essential to being any good at fencing at all, and it is often the make or break piece that changes whether or not a technique is successful or completely fails. So for this first exchange, we see my opponent here, Dan, lunges in, tries to throw a thrust to my right bicep. I set it off to my right side, step in with my right leg, and throw a right Zverkow, which lands, and simultaneously kind of defends me, though I think I do kind of get hit on the top of the shoulder here. But the real point about this that I want to showcase is the footwork. And the first bit of footwork we have to talk about is the lunge that my opponent does, which is perfectly adequate, normal, and very effective. However, there's something to be said about the lunge, and that is it has a rather long recovery period. Recovery period being the time when your foot first lands and maybe your attack probably first lands, and all the time you spend pushing backwards with your front leg attempting to cancel out the momentum that you produced by pushing forwards with your back leg. And that's basically how all lunges work. But the key thing here is that this particular form of footwork was countered by the footwork that I used. And the footwork that I used is a little bit more complicated than just a passing step. When you watch this back, what happens is again, my opponent comes in with the lunge, but the second I see that thrust miss me, I take one tiny step off to my left with my left leg, and then a big step forward with my right leg. And the reason this footwork is an important counter to what is happening here is because A, I take my little tiny step with my left foot to open up my hips and give myself a better range of motion for my right Zverkow, but I also do it while my opponent is in their recovery period of their lunge. As you can see here, as my opponent's foot lands, mine starts to move, and the entire time my opponent spends trying to cancel out their forward momentum and then start going backwards, I am already setting up my next step, which is going to be able to move far further forward than my opponent can move backwards off of a recovery from a lunge. Lunges are very difficult to come out of. And even if you're someone who's really, really good at getting out of a lunge, maybe because you've done a lot of Olympic fencing, there is no version of reality where you can recover from a lunge faster than I can take one simple step forward. So the idea here is that if you want to counter somebody who likes to lunge in and out of range all the time, try this kind of footwork where you take a tiny little pivoting step or a tiny little setup step with your front forward leg and then take a big follow-up step with your back leg. And what you can often do is cancel out any amount of backwards momentum that your opponent can get and chase them down very effectively. Now, for this next exchange, it's pretty simple. Again, my opponent comes in with a nice feint, hits me, and then attempts to defend, and my footwork is completely non-existent, which is part of the reason why it was so successful. However, I think it goes without saying that if you don't move your feet, you're going to lose. But there's something a little bit more important to break down here, and that is footedness, or I guess handedness. So, as a lot of people will point out, a lot of people in HEMA like to fence with their dominant arm and dominant leg forward. And that is very, very useful because you can lunge, you can get in with simple steps, you can throw, and most importantly, you can attack along the exact same vector that you're moving your feet. And this is the part that a lot of people don't talk about. Now, when we watch this exchange, what happens is my opponent, Dan, comes forward with a feint, but they're doing so with a passing step. And normally this is a really, really smart thing to do because, as everyone knows, passing steps take much longer than simple steps. But during that period in which your foot is traveling from one place to another, this is an absolutely great opportunity to throw feints, as my opponent does. Because my opponent is coming forward with a big step, I know that they're going to attack. And when they throw that feint, I believe that it's going to come directly at me because it is accompanied by that passing step. However, it was a feint, and he manages to hit me on the shoulder and then attempt to parry after. However, there is another thing to talk about here, and that is attack and defense vectors, which is, I guess, a really fancy way to say that which hand you have forward and which leg you have forward need to match in order to get the best kind of body structure for both your attacks and your defenses. In this particular case, my opponent took a step with their right leg when they are left-handed. Again, not necessarily a problem. However, when they threw their attack, they threw it with their left arm being forward, again, because they're left-handed. And when they went to parry the after blow, it was on their left side. Normally, this means that having your left leg forward allows you very easily to get the arm that is forward and the sword that's attached to it to get right up into the spot that it needs to be. However, because my opponent had taken a step with their right leg was forward when they attempted this defense, and as a result, it left a little bit of a hole for me to sneak my blade into. If my opponent had had their left leg forward when they did this defense, and maybe had done the exact same lunging footwork that we saw in the previous exchange, this entire thing might have worked out a little bit better, except they would have been lacking the passing step that was crucial to their feint. So what can you do about it? Well, you can always use simple steps to feint as well. Simple steps are often just as threatening as passing steps, and although you miss out on that travel aspect for threatening your opponent, you can simply throw more than one simple step. This is the kind of thing you see from Olympic fencers all the time, where they will use footwork to set up more footwork and use the fact that their footwork is very fast to simply do more of it in a shorter amount of time and enhance the ability for them to confuse their opponent's defense. Now, for this next exchange, we have another poor footwork choice on my part. What we see from this exchange is my opponent attempts to stab me. I get out of the way by backing up a little bit, but right in the middle of my process of backing up, I decide to throw a thrust counterattack of my own, which just gets within an inch of landing, at which point it is parried off to the side by my opponent, and he throws his own counter shot over the top. Now, what does footwork have to do with this exchange? As we see here, my opponent comes in with a very nice little lunging attack that wasn't really quite going to land. However, the reason that they threw this little lunging attack is that they were also able to, with their lead leg forward, push backwards fast enough and accurately enough to get back out of measure. Getting back out of measure being the key component as to the reason why I was not able to land my thrust. If they had simply stayed in the position they ended at when they threw their attack, my attack would have landed perfectly flush and it would have scored undoubtedly. However, that's not what happened. But there was another failure here, and that was my failure to choose the correct footwork to throw my follow-up thrust. As you can see, as I scooch my legs and my hands backwards to try to defend myself from the attack that my opponent originally threw, I pivot from this exact position with my left leg forward to throwing a passing step with my thrust. And if you slow down the video and watch it very carefully, what you see here is that I extend my hands and even lean my body forward as far as I possibly can, but I only go so far because my right leg, which is currently driving me forward, has not yet passed my left leg in distance. The problem here being is that I had to push off with a significant amount of force with my back leg, which was my right leg, in order to start this motion. But during the travel phase is when my tip would have landed in my opponent. But that travel phase had not progressed to the point which it had actually gained me any distance forward. Essentially, I threw this thrust without moving at all. Despite the fact that my foot was going to end up moving, it held me back and it slowed me down. Now, if I had instead pushed off with my back leg and moved my left leg forward, I probably would have landed this thrust, as moving my left leg forward would have dragged my hips and my torso with it, and I would have been able to augment the fact that I was extending my arms and extending my torso to make it all the way in. At the exact same time, I would have landed in a position where my left leg was, had a lot of weight on it. But chances are, if my opponent had tried to set me or even successfully set me off to the side and thrown a counterattack, my left leg would have been forward, and I probably would have been able to put up some kind of defense, but I probably would have been hit in the afterblow because, again, I am right-handed, and when your left leg is forward, and especially in a deep stance, it's really, really hard to defend that opposite side of your body. So it probably would have been better for me to commit further with my front forward leg and just throw that lunge out there, hoping that I land that thrust. And in that case, I think it would have been successful. But there's always a give and take, where if you commit further forward with your feet, you also commit further forward with your body and your torso, and it makes it much harder to defend an afterblow. So this next exchange is a little bit scary because my mask comes off, but it is still important to watch because it can tell you a lot about what bad footwork really looks like and what bad footwork can do to you specifically. So, as you can probably tell, I am the one doing the bad footwork here since I get stabbed in the face. But what specifically happens is that I take a big passing step on the open of the exchange, and I'm looking to throw some kind of big attack, but my opponent takes a big passing step backwards, and I just can't keep up with them. In this particular case, the bad footwork isn't the fact that I took a passing step, but the fact that I didn't do it with any kind of explosivity or speed, and my opponent was just very easily able to match me. But that's not all. Not only did I take a big step that was kind of slow and very trudgy, but more importantly, when my right foot lands, my momentum is still going forward. And as a result, I have to take another follow-up step with my left leg. However, my opponent has done a much smarter passing step backwards, and the second their foot lands, they are now in a neutral position from which they can either move forward or backward on command. As a result, when I start taking this secondary step that I didn't really want to take, my opponent seizes this opportunity to attack forward, utilizing the fact that I am now walking into a situation, I am now walking into range without any attack of my own to simply throw something out there. As a result of me moving forward and not really anticipating this, my defense is not good enough, and I unintentionally shove a sword directly into my face and specifically into the overlay of my mask, which results in my head snapping back and my mask coming off. But what's important to note here is that when a lot of people tell you that you have bad footwork, this is usually the kind of thing that they're talking about. They're talking about not necessarily the steps that you're doing, but the fact that you don't seem to be able to stop and start your own momentum with the strength of your legs in the specific footwork that you're using. So if you're the kind of person who throws big lunges, but you can't get out of them, you might want to start shortening up your lunges. If you're the type of person who takes big passing steps and you always find yourself having to take that extra step afterwards, you're going to want to start taking shorter steps. Whatever it means that you have to start shortening up your footwork, it usually means two things. One, that you're pushing off way too hard with the back foot, so much so that you can't stop yourself with whatever the front foot ends up being. And more importantly, that you're probably fencing with whatever leg forward you have based on your ability to produce that force on the back end, but not land with it on the front end. Think people who fight with their right leg forward, push off with their left leg for all of their force, but then somehow don't have enough force with their dominant leg to recover. It's a simple matter of physics that every single time you take a step, you're actually doing two things with both legs. You're pushing off with one and stopping with the other. And if you have the kind of problem that you see here, where you just can't stop yourself, it probably means that you need to work on your leg strength in whichever leg you happen to always end up having forward. Now, for this final exchange, I want to talk about offline footwork, the white whale of HEMA, or at least it is to all the commenters who like to tell me I'm bad. But the key thing to offline footwork is oftentimes that people think of offline footwork as being far more dramatic than it actually is. If you do any other kind of combat sport like boxing or MMA, you'll understand that offline footwork often is just a matter of inches, getting your center line just 1 or 2 inches off to some kind of pivot point so that you just have a slightly better angle at reaching whatever your target happens to be. And in this exchange, we see something pretty similar. My opponent comes forward with a bit of a feint. I throw an attack over the top, and my opponent counters that attack by throwing an undercut straight to my face, which simultaneously attacks my head and defends himself by kind of ending up in that left hanger. However, the importance of footwork here has to do with offline, and if you watch this exchange, one key thing that you're going to notice is that when my opponent takes their full passing step, they end up with their left leg forward, but most importantly, they end up with their left leg to the left side of my left leg, meaning that my opponent's left hip was further to the outside than my front hip. The reason this is important is because this particular attack that my opponent threw crossed their left line into their right line, meaning that it had to cross my center line in order to be effective at both hitting its target and defending. By taking his foot and crossing the center line physically from being on the left side to now being on the right side of my body, he effectively crossed the line both with his attack and with his footwork. And this is what a lot of people don't realize when they talk about the lack of offline footwork in HEMA. What they don't realize is that at first watch, it doesn't seem like any offline footwork is used at all. However, in my opinion, this simple little adjustment of moving his foot maybe 3 or 4 inches to the right completely changed the outcome of this exchange. If you want to imagine what would happen if my opponent had moved his foot back 3 or 4 inches to his left, what you might imagine is that his hips would have been far more square to mine, and as a result, there would have been far more physical body in the way of my counterattack. By moving his foot over to the right, he moved his whole hip to the right and his whole torso to the right. And not only did it mean that the section that his blade crossed would, go across my center line, but also meant that I was throwing an attack towards something that I thought was going to exist on the right side of the center line. But once I threw my attack, realized that nothing was there. By moving his foot further to his left, he would have ended up with far more of his body on my right side of the center line, which is exactly what I was attacking. So the idea of offline footwork here primarily exists in the world of HEMA to essentially void targets or seek new targets. I talked in the beginning about attack and defense vectors, and this is, again, another one of those important considerations. The idea here is that if you change where your body is, chances are you have the ability to dodge whatever attack somebody throws at you. But if their attack vector is such that it crosses through the center line, you have to have something in the center line in order to stop them. So by changing the center line and shifting it off to one side, you accomplish both goals simultaneously. You move what your opponent thinks is the center line off to one side, ensuring that if they're throwing an offline cut, they're probably not going to reach you. And more importantly, you are leaving something in your center line to deal with any cut that they throw that actually would cross not only their center line, but the new one that you have created with your footwork. So, as a result, if you can use this footwork effectively, and again, with only a matter of an inches or two of adjustment, you can very, very effectively augment any kind of attack or defense that you might be throwing that sometimes you find should work, but just doesn't quite make it there. But that's all I got to talk about. If you want to see more stuff like this, feel free to subscribe. I'm actually going to be trying to make more shorts from now on, just because it seems like people like them and it's something for me to do on some off hours. But I will be back with a full video next Tuesday.